Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you for attending this ACRL webinar. I'm Ann Matsushima Chu. I'm a social science librarian at Reed College in Portland, and I'm a member of the ACRL Oregon board. So right now, if you could mute your microphone, if you haven't already done so, please also turn off your video. Beth is going to be taking questions kind of at the middle part and the end of the session. So at those moments when we take question and answers, you could either like unmute your microphone at the bottom of the screen and use that, or you could put your question in the chat. Feel free to use the chat box to ask questions as they come up. Candace and I will be collecting all those chat questions and sharing them with Beth as the Q&A comes up. So after this session, when the recording is ready, everyone that signed up and registered for this will receive an email with a link to the recorded session and any other materials that the speaker might want to share, such as the slides. And then we'll also have a session evaluation form, and so we really appreciate if you would fill that out too. So that so this session is a part of the kind of Manuka conference that usually happens around the summer and fall. And so what ACRL Oregon board decided to do is kind of offer these webinars once a month in lieu of that because of COVID-19. So today's webinar is entitled, Speaking of Quality, Do Librarians and Instructors Assess Student Sources in the Same Way? And today our presenter is Beth Pickard. Beth is a science and social science librarian at Portland State University. Her background includes undergraduate and graduate work in anthropology at the University of Chicago and extensive ethnography training as a part of the ethnography research in Illinois' academic library project. Her scholarly work makes use of ethnographic methods and includes the research project and the library, first generation college seniors versus freshmen in college and research libraries, and what we talk about when we talk about quality. A librarian and instructor compare how they assess student sources in collaborative librarianship. And we're really excited for Beth to be here today, and I'm going to pin their video and they will be sharing their slides.
All right. Thank you, Anne. And let me just get a second. I will just to say to everybody, again, if you have any trouble hearing me, please say it in chat, and I will repeat whatever needs to be repeated. I apologize for not having headphones, and I will try to get my let's see. It's going to take me. I'm sorry, just 1 second while I get this up and going. All right, let me share my screen, and actually, hold on just a second. My apologies, I practiced this last night and it was working interestingly. So let's do this. All right, let me share my screen and see. So we'll share my screen, and then I'll try to start the show. And there we go. Is everyone seeing, are you seeing my notes or are you seeing the full screen? I hope.
We're seeing the full screen.
Excellent. That's what was going wonky last night. All right, great. Well, let me start by saying, I hope there's a link to the article. This is a study that just came out. This presentation reports on a study that just came out in the journal Collaborative Librarianship, and there should be, I put a link in the chat to that article. It came out in June. And Anne mentioned that I had had some ethnographic training as part of a research project in Illinois called the Ethnographic Research in Illinois Academic Libraries, or ACRL. And that was a project, an LSTA funded project that involved 5 universities, and we received some intensive training on using ethnographic methods in research. But from Nancy Freed Foster, I don't know if you're familiar with her work, but she was part of Ithaca. She's an anthropologist at University of Rochester. But the ACRL study in addition to giving us that training, focused on how students, librarians, and teaching faculty work together and how that work affects all of us, but in particular, how it affects students' research practices. And the project I'll talk about today takes that idea and some parts of that methodology and compares how a librarian and instructor went about evaluating student sources in a case study. And the project, excuse me, came about while I was doing another larger study that that Joan, I think, referred to a moment ago. It's a multi-year study that I did with with a member of the anthropology faculty at PSU. We worked together to compare modes of information literacy instruction in asynchronous online courses. It's a multi-year study, and we tried across 7 different terms, different modes of information literacy instruction, and then compared the bibliographies, the students' final project bibliographies, and how they changed under these different modes of information literacy instruction. And again, a multi-year project, we looked at a lot of bibliographies. And as we were looking at the bibliographies and talking, her name is, by the way, the anthropologist's name is Sarah Sterling. So if I refer to Sarah, I'm speaking about the anthropologist, my research partner. We were looking at lots of bibliographies and talking about them and discussing them, coding them. We noticed that there were some differences between us in how we approached evaluating sources. Some ones that we felt like might be kind of significant. And so we decided to do a separate study, a sort of spin-off study. And that study involved a close examination of our own approaches. And it unearthed some implicit practices, some respective implicit practices, so some different implicit practices functioning, as well as some nuanced ways we differed in our approach to evaluating student sources and ways that we really should align. And so we weren't just looking at, oh, you chose that source as good and I chose that source as bad, but we really, because we were using this ethnographic coding, we were able to get at which parts of the citation are you actually looking at? What do you perceive as relevant or not? How are you talking about the term academic? And how we looked at we found some differences in how we actually went about measuring each source or set of sources that is the bibliography. And that's important because if we have implicit rubrics, like in terms of what I think is important and what as a librarian and what the instructor thinks is important, that's gonna affect how we guide students, what we teach them in information literacy instruction, what we teach them, how we talk to them about sources, and how we grade them, and what we say in assignments. And all working rubrics should be transparent to students. If they're going to be measured in some way, if things are going to be weighted in certain ways, or there's certain aspects of their citation that are going to be graded more intensely than others, and that needs to be made clear to them before they start the work. And so with that in mind, this can inform librarians' work in terms of most of what we do, right? I consider instruction, information literacy instruction, which can be the development of pedagogy and curriculum, like how we do it and what we do, what we teach and how we teach it, in terms of reference encounters, or consultations, traditional one-shot sessions, or maybe even developing digital learning objects for asynchronous online courses. However, basically any conversations that we have with students typically are guiding and instructional conversations with respect to sources, how to search, how to evaluate sources. And of course, this can inform our collaboration with teaching faculty, our being we librarians, our work with teaching faculty. So this case study, what we decided to do for this spin-off study in terms of methodology is we looked at 16 bibliographies from Sarah's Anthropology 350 class, which is a research methods class. And the bibliographies weren't the data. The bibliographies just served as a conversation point for us to then create some other data. So basically what we did is we did 3 things to create data. We ranked the bibliographies. We took these 16 bibliographies, and I went off in my little corner, and Sarah went off in her little corner, and we tried to rank them, right? And we did this separately because we didn't want to influence each other. I wanted whatever weird, maybe fantastic thing I did to evaluate the sources, or awful thing that I did, to be purely my own, and not to influence Sarah's fantastic uniqueness or awfulness, whatever it was that we were bringing to the table. and rank them. And so we did it away from each other, and we took copious notes. We took notes on why we ranked certain bibliographies certain ways, what we were thinking about the citations, like what we were looking at, any challenges that we faced in ranking, just to really, the terms we were using, how we were thinking about things. And those notes became the data that we then later coded. Then the next step that we took was then to evaluate the individual citations as opposed to the bibliographies. And so we did this separately so as not to influence each other, and we took copious notes on that process as well. Then the third step that we took to create data was we came together to discuss the process of ranking and the process of evaluating individual sources, and we discussed that. And we had the opportunity to look at each other's notes and to look at each other's rankings, and we asked each other questions about that. And we made an audio recording of this conversation and then transcribed it. And so the notes and the transcription became the data, and then we coded them. We coded the notes and the transcription, and some themes emerged about quality, about how we were going about defining quality. So unlike some prior studies, we didn't say these bibliographies, this citation would be good and this kind of citation would be bad. What we really wanted to do was unearth what our working definitions of quality were and how those working definitions might differ. So these themes emerged from the coding that turned into kind of what we called indicators of quality, which is in essence a rubric that was like a reverse rubric. Instead of a rubric that we were using to measure things, this was the rubric it turned out we had used to measure things, but we called them indicators of quality. And the librarian instructor differed in a few ways with respect to these indicators. We each used a combination of indicators. Obviously, like we didn't just look at, oh, you had the right number of sources, your bibliography is fine, but we may have looked at how specific the topic was and did they use a variety of journals and things like that. But the librarian used a different combination of indicators than the instructor to measure the same bibliographies. We applied the indicators differently than each other in terms of frequency and in terms of weight. We unearthed that we were doing some weighting of these indicators. What's not super surprising is we figured out that we both valued thoroughness, right? Of course, librarians and instructors, I think, would very easily say in that broad stroke that we want students to thoroughly support their topics with sources, by citing sources. But the librarian, myself, differed from the instructor in what indicated thoroughness to them. And we also differed in that what cued us to consult the full text. Like if we felt like something, and when we were comfortable just sticking with the citation in terms of evaluating the source. And we also turned out to have different working definitions of academic, and which would certainly have implications for how the kinds of sources we would guide students to find. And finally, we unearthed some implicit assessment practices that were different some of them were the same for both of us, and some of them were different. These are some of the indicators of quality that we found. Just to be clear, you can notice the first one, that is number of citations. And that one's fairly obvious because the assignment specified students were to find 3 sources. And the thing that we noted about this, the only reason we listed it is because we found that when students exceeded that, we ranked their bibliographies higher when they exceeded 3 sources. When students used fewer than 3 sources, we dinged them. That's pretty obvious stuff, but I'm gonna mention it later, so I wanna mention it now. Basically what you can see in the upper left corner is the stuff, those are the indicators like variety among journals cited, variety among databases used, variety among authors used, date spread, number of peer-reviewed sources, having used the database to determine that. Those are the things that those are the indicators the librarian used to rank bibliographies the most. That turns out those were the working indicators in how she ranked bibliographies. On the right, upper right, is the instructor. It's where the instructor and the librarian kind of overlap with that. And you can see that that the anthropologist, the instructor, looked at variety among journals cited. She looked at variety among authors cited, and she looked a little bit at the date spread of citations, and she didn't look at the variety among databases at all. And then the bottom right is really that shows this is a frequency, right? This table really shows the frequency with which these indicators were applied. And the lower right shows the ones that the instructor applied the most frequently, but the librarian really didn't. And so things like topic specificity, style and formatting, the significance of the journals cited. And so what we noticed when we laid out this table was that the frequency with which these indicators were applied really reflect the different concerns of librarians and instructors' work. They reflect the respective subject specialties, and they reflect their daily practices. For example, the instructor brought to this analysis a deep understanding of the topic, or brought to her ranking, I should say, a deep understanding of the topics. She designs the assignments with a specific topic in mind. And she also works with specific documentation style, which is the American Association, which is now they just use Chicago style. But the librarian, sort of in contrast, oops, sorry. Oh, goodness. I don't know what happened, sorry. I think I lost my, sorry, but the librarian, I think we're back on this right slide now. The librarian has different daily work and has a different subject background than the instructor. She, being me, I work with hundreds of journal article databases, like lots of librarians. I track subject and journal coverage of different databases, and I work specifically to facilitate student and faculty research in ways that rely heavily on these resources, on these databases. So that was one of the things that we found by looking at the frequency of the indicators. But one of the things that we also noted, because we ranked the bibliographies, right? We had some top bibliographies and we had some that we thought, you know, could use some work. We noticed that there was a difference in the indicators that were applied the most frequently and the ones that were actually used to rank bibliographies at the top or bottom, which suggests that some of the indicators are being weighted more than others. Some of them carried more weight. Now, to be clear, one of the things that pointed to our shared values, our shared thinking, was that when we ranked the bibliographies, which was quite hard because we were using a combination, we used different combinations, was that we found we were able to put 3 clearly at the top and 2 clearly at the bottom. And we both put the same 3 at the top and the same 2 at the bottom. So we had some shared thinking, but we selected the top and the bottom for different reasons. And these are some of the indicators that were used to rank the bibliographies at the top and the bottom, right? And the instructor emphasized, in particular, the significance of the journal and topic specificity. There are a lot of ways that she emphasized things, and that I, the librarian, emphasized things. But one example that pointed to the fact that some of these were weighted more than others came up with the significance of the journals. The instructor had applied this indicator to only 12.5% of the overall bibliography. So the frequency was pretty low, but she used it in 50% to rank 50% of the lowest ones, meaning there was a problem with the significance of the journals, and with 33% of the highest ranked ones, which meant they were using significant journals. So what this meant was when this was a factor, it carried more weight with the instructor than some of the other indicators that were used to rank the same, that were applied to the same bibliography. In contrast, and this is another way that we figured out that things were being weighted, is the librarian used some indicators to select top and bottom bibliographies that she rarely used overall. So she didn't use them very frequently. So for example, the date spread of citations, she used in like 67% of the top ones, but only 50% overall. And in terms of the number of peer-reviewed sources cited, she again used it in like 67% of the top ones, but only in 43% overall. It's not a huge difference in those numbers between frequency and weight, but it does suggest that when the librarian was able to discern one of these qualities, it affected her ranking more than other indicators found in the same bibliography. And for both librarian and instructor, this close examination unearthed some implicit rubrics at work and the need to reflect on those. Some issues that came up that are related. Sometimes the frequency and the rate were the same. Sometimes something that an indicator that was applied really frequently also carried a lot of weight, like it was given more weight than other indicators applied to the same bibliography. But it hadn't necessarily been emphasized explicitly to students. For example, the instructor used topic specificity in ranking bibliographies at the top and the bottom. So they carried a lot of weight. And also, she applied it to over 90% of the total bibliographies. The problem lies in that the only thing the assignment said to students about specific is the phrase that is on the slide, which is that the topic needs to be specific and researchable with library resources. But that limited amount of attention may not be enough to have conveyed, may not have been enough to have conveyed the weight that the word specific was being given, right? The instructor was looking at it, was looking at it really heavily, was weighting that. And so students knowing that they were going to be graded on that is pretty important. So it's important for the assignment, it's important in terms for the instructor, that's important for her in terms of changes she might want to make to the assignment, but also for her practice with students, her daily practice, and what she emphasizes to students, or, you know, and how she grades them, or refrains from grading them. If she realizes she hasn't made it explicit to students that they need to be very specific in their topic, then maybe that's something that shouldn't be part of the grading until it has been made explicit. For the librarian, this kind of pointed, the things that we've uncovered really pointed to the fact that the librarian was thinking of bibliographies a little differently than instructors, which would inform how she guides students and might lead to her pointing students to things that are not exactly in line with what the instructor was hoping for them to use for the assignment. Again, for both librarian and instructor, this examination unearths some implicit rubrics at work and the need to reflect on them. And the next slide kind of spells out a little bit of, the next two slides spell out a little bit of why this is important. Like the instructor needed to reflect on her rubrics for again, we mentioned the clarity of assignments, but also for transparency for students, the nuances of what was being graded, what was actually being graded and what was weighted, right? How much weight was being ascribed to these different things. And the librarian, right, also needed to align her daily practice more in keeping with the instructor and understanding that her daily practice, right, and her subject specialty might inform the rubrics that were at work, implicit and explicit, and to recognize how her working rubrics might differ from the instructor's in terms of how she's recommending sources to students and how she's teaching students to search and how she's teaching students to evaluate sources and citations or abstracts. Even looking in the database, we get that little tiny bit, and for use in the coursework, and how does a student select sources from that little bit of information? How do we teach them that? This is about halfway through. Does anybody have any questions or need any clarification at this point? All right, I don't hear anything, so I'm going to go on, but Anne or Candace, please feel free to interrupt me if I've missed something.
Yeah, folks could feel free to add their questions in the chat right now, or they can go ahead and unmute themselves.
Yeah, absolutely. Either way would be great. I'll give it a few.
Hi, Beth. This is, oh, go ahead.
Oh, go ahead, yeah.
This is Lori. I work at Mount Hood Community College. So a quick question. On that, I think it was the last slide or something, you made reference to the instructor's assignment instructions saying something about topics need to be specific and use library resources. Was that the only indication to the students? I guess what I'm asking is, did they know that they were supposed to use only library resources for this?
Yes, and yes, they did, you know, that they were supposed to use library resources for this.
Exclusively, so no internet.
Yeah, they said from the library. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. Anyone else? Oop, that's my next one.
I noticed, Beth, this is Anne.
Yeah, hi, Anne.
I noticed that the instructor weighted articles from various databases as something that was more important to them, and then the librarian that wasn't as important.
Oh, it's the opposite.
Oh, the opposite. So the librarian wanted a variety of resources from various databases.
Yep.
Can you talk a little bit about that? I mean, like,
Sure.
why didn't the professor or the instructor, why do you think that didn't, like, if someone had 12 articles from only JSTOR, for instance,
Right. Right.
versus like a topic specific database?
Sure, absolutely. Well, I'll talk about this a little bit later too, but what we connected, the sort of ligaments that we found, were that it wasn't that she didn't care. It was just she was looking at it through, her lens was differently granulated, and that the instructor was actually looking at sources from the library, which is in keeping with the last question, right? Like, she was specifically looking at sources from the library as somehow they would all do that work. Right. And the librarian, in keeping with her daily practice, was focused on the databases, like marking that, signifying that, like, you know, if they used JSTOR, for example, right, then that would be scholarly and peer reviewed. So that's one way she's using the databases, but using different databases reflected to the librarian. And we'll talk about this in a little bit, because this is part of what our conversation unearthed was. I was like, okay, that to me, that allows for the idea that the student may have searched broadly and iteratively. So they may have done what I would consider a more rigorous search, but also might have a more in-depth understanding of that larger research landscape. So I was looking at the databases to sort of signify those things, like the student search process. Like, did the student understand that there were multiple databases out there? Did the student know how to use those databases? Did the student, did the student look for peer-reviewed stuff? So it kind of reflects the way that I go about constructing authority in my daily practice versus how the instructor goes about constructing authority in her daily practice. Does that make sense?
Yeah, interesting.
Yeah.
We have another question from Hannah. Can you talk some more about the peer-reviewed sources difference? Also fine if you said all you have to say about that, or if you're going to discuss later.
The peer-reviewed sources difference, the difference between the instructor and the librarian? Is that?
Yes.
Question, Hannah? Okay. Well, we are going to talk about that, but I want to touch on it now when you have the question too. So the number the instructor was looking at, she saw that. So here's the thing. This is when it comes up with the term academic, right? And I will delve into that a little bit, that we had different working definitions of academic. And the librarian, was assuming that by academic, she meant peer reviewed, and she didn't. The instructor really, but the instructor also had a broad, the instructor in this case was thinking of the library as an all academic place. So anything from the library is academic, right? Like, that was her container. So she didn't specify peer reviewed. She meant academic, but she meant the library that meant the same thing to her. She didn't actually necessarily mean peer reviewed, because she meant peer reviewed because she was actually open to students using articles that were written by experts, but maybe like gray literature, or may have been, an editorial in a magazine, but or some kind of discussion, more non-peer-reviewed discussion of ongoing research, right, by an expert in the field. So she was actually open to stuff that I didn't know she was open to. So does that kind of get to your question, Hannah?
Hannah says yes.
Okay, great. Yeah, these are good questions.
Oh, and one more question from Dan. Is he's wondering if any students cited books.
That's an excellent question, and yes, and we did a whole series of analysis on format. I didn't include it because the assignment specifies, it says, please use journal articles from the library. So it was kind of like the number of citations thing. Like, we found some things around it, but because the assignment had given them a very specific directive, we didn't go into it too much. But what we did find that we found interesting was that when students did cite a variety of formats, which is why that indicator is in there, when they did cite a variety of formats, like if they cited books as well as journal articles, especially if they were exceeding the number of minimum required sources, we bumped them up, right? So both of us bumped up the formats. Yeah, variety of formats. I think you can see it in the slide I have up. The variety of formats cited. We looked only at, we applied it to 6.3% which is one. There was one person that did it, but both of us independently of each other said, hey, that's great. They did a book too, and we noted it. So it wasn't just that they had more sources. We specifically noted that they also used a variety of formats as it's something that allowed for, like, it indicated to us that the student had a fuller understanding of what was available to them and knew how to use it. So that affected our rankings. Yeah, that's a really good question, because I was pretty excited about that. And then we were like, it's just one. So we can't really say that. We can't really make a generalized claim, but we did find it interesting for sure. And I think, let's see if it was in variety of formats. Yeah, that was in our top. For me, it was for the librarian. Yeah, for both of us, the variety among formats cited was used to rank that one towards the top as well. All right. Anne, are there any other questions pending? Or Candace? Anybody who can see chat? I can't see chat when I'm
Nothing right now.
screen. No. Okay, great. Okay, great. Well, I will go ahead and go. I'll go ahead and go on then. One of the other themes that emerged that's not super duper surprising was that the librarian and the instructor both valued thoroughness, right? And that's not terribly surprising. Of course, we would say in broad strokes that the librarian and the instructor would want students to support their research, to support their topics with, lots of sources. Like, support it well, support it thoroughly. And we sort of agreed upon the indicators, like the indicators that we both ended up in one way or the other, either applying or noting in our discussions, were variety among journals, the date spread, and variety among databases. And these played out a little bit differently between librarian and instructor. So for variety among journals, both the librarian and the instructor saw this as a marker that allowed for more thorough coverage of topics. Right. And the same kind of goes for the number of citations, right? It's not so much variety, but like if they have more sources, they may have supported that allowed for students to have supported their topic more thoroughly. We had the question, of course, was this made explicit? Was the variety among journals, our emphasis on that, was that actually made explicit to students in assignments or in any kind of information literacy instruction they received? In terms of the date spread, the librarian and instructor differed a little bit. They both used this indicator to rank bibliographies at the top because they thought that it allowed for seminal works to have been cited, or the librarian specifically thought that it allowed for seminal works to have been cited. She didn't. I'm talking about me in the third person, which feels weird. The librarian, did not use it for bottom rankings because I felt a little limited in my expertise. This Anthropology 350 is it's a research methods course. And so students were they were talking about, they had research projects on Mesoamerica, they had research projects in ancient Egypt, they had research projects in Oceania, they had research projects on Inuit. I mean, they had a lot of different projects. And my background in anthropology is I'm pretty Mesoamerica literate, but I'm not Egyptology literate. And I didn't feel comfortable dinging anyone. I felt comfortable putting them towards the top if they had had a date spread, because I thought it allowed for seminal works to have been cited. But if they didn't, I didn't feel comfortable dinging them for that. And also keeping in mind that there was a 3-source requirement. I mean, there's not a huge date spread that can be facilitated with that within just 3 sources, and it might have looked different if we had been looking at bibliographies from a PhD thesis, right? We would expect seminal works to show up. It would be longer. We would expect a lot of things. So I'm sure we brought different lenses with that in mind. But one of the things that was also interesting about this one is that it was clearly my applying this indicator was working. It was an implicit part of a rubric, because, for example, with respect to how many sources students had cited, I turned to the assignment for that before sort of using that to assess students' bibliographies. But in terms of date spread, I didn't look at the assignment one way or the other before I bumped bibliographies up towards the top because they had a date spread, right? It didn't. So that was sort of an implicit expectation. And on the other hand, the instructor's she was all explicit in the way she ranked with respect to date spread. She also thought, slightly different take on it. I thought it allowed for seminal works to have been cited, and she thought that it allowed for the history of concepts to be reflected. So, right, situating it in the scholarly conversation that was going on. But she noted this when we talked about it and in her notes, but she didn't use it to rank it because it wasn't in the assignment, which means it was functioning explicitly. Likewise, variety among databases. This was a librarian only thing. We talked about this just a little bit ago. Not the instructor saw. I saw variety among databases as allowing for students a more thorough understanding by students. Like if I saw that there were a variety among the databases that they use, then it indicated to me that they may have had a better understanding of the research landscape, like the kinds of sources that are out there, the formats of sources that are out there, and the variety of databases that are out there to use, and the ways they work differently. And I also thought that it might have allowed for the student having done deeper and potentially iterative, searching. So it indicated that to me. And so in some ways I was looking, part of what I was ranking was the student search process, and not just the artifacts from that process, not just the citations as they supported the topic, but how had the student done their research, right? That was part of what I was kind of measuring, also sort of implicit. Right. So allowed for is a little bit of a problematic shorthand. That allowed for thing. We talked about that it allowed for seminal works to have been cited. It allowed for the history of the concept to be there. It allowed for students to have done iterative searching. There are lots of citing more sources allowed for students to have covered their topic more thoroughly. There's a lot of allowed for in there, which is potential and not necessarily verified. We were ranking them based on the potential that the citation suggested, right? So it's problematic because exceeding the required number of sources may or may not cover a topic better. It really depends on the sources, right? And typically, and this is true, there's research on this, and it's not surprising, no librarian or instructor has time to dig back into sources, the full text of sources for citations. If I do a sample search for a student at the reference desk or even in a consultation, I will look at the list and I will use that abbreviated version to determine whether or not that looked like a useful search for them, like useful search terms. I don't go and read the full text of every single article. And likewise, the instructor doesn't have time to read the full text of every single article in the bibliographies for students' final research projects, right? She looks at the citation to do that sort of representing work. And so in keeping with that, neither librarian or instructor looked at how, but even without looking at the full text, neither the librarian or instructor looked at how or if the citations worked together to support the topic. So we looked at them as a collection, but we didn't really look to see if there had been like thorough coverage, if they really covered everything they needed to cover. And we talked about the dates allowing for seminal works to be cited, but we didn't look to see if the bibliography actually included seminal works. We just thought, well, the dates allowed for that to happen, but we didn't verify whether it had happened. And again, we rarely looked at the full text because that's in keeping with everybody's best practice for time reasons. And that's pretty ubiquitous, I think. But the full text versus citation thing we found kind of interesting, because when we were looking only at the citation and not the full text, the librarian, this shows you the number of sources. It's just a number. It doesn't tell us which sources we chose, but just the number. Did we have similar numbers? And when we were only looking at the citation and not the full text, the librarian selected fewer sources as problematic than did the instructor. And when we did look at the full text, the librarian and instructor were in full agreement, right? So then our numbers were the same. But what's also interesting about this is not only did we become more aligned, but in looking at the full text, there was actually a shift in numbers. We both found additional ones problematic. And in terms of, this is a really broad brush, by the way. I know this is just like, were they problematic or were they appropriate to the assignment? Did they help with the assignment or did they actually like detract from the assignment or do no supporting work? But some of the ways in which we went about this differed. Like when looking at the citation, the librarians, I saw some sources as problematic because the citation showed that there was it was 2 or 3 pages long, and my brain said, there's no way that's a research article. That's got to be either popular or not academic in the way I was defining academic. Whereas the instructor deemed sources problematic based on topic specificity and based on style formatting, right? Which again reflects her kind of subject specialty and daily work is a little different. But what we also found interesting was that not only did the numbers shift, not only did we become aligned, but we actually both found a larger number of sources that were actually problematic. And what that did for my librarian brain was I just imagined what a discussion about these sources may have taught students about constructing authority in their research projects. Like what would have happened if they had submitted their bibliography and then there had been an exercise, or we'd had some time to sit down with them and say, hey, we noticed that you have these sources which are doing all this kind of good work, and you have these other sources which are problematic because they're doing this other kind of work. It just seemed like it held a lot of potential for information literacy instruction. So this is looking just at numbers, but the next diagram, the next figure really shows specifically an overlap with the specific sources. So the last chart showed, well, I found 3 sources problematic this is an example, and the instructor found 3 sources problematic, but they may have been different sources. Like she may have found these 3 and then I found these other 3. This looks at the specific sources that we chose. And when we were looking at citations, I selected different sources than she did, right? So the numbers didn't align, but when we looked at the full text, we chose exactly, not only the same numbers, but we chose the exact same sources as problematic and appropriate. And what we thought was useful about this was, there's not a whole lot we can do about consulting citations versus the full text as a regular practice. There's just not enough, there aren't enough hours in the day. But that meeting and discussing, like our collaboration, like meeting and discussing prompted our visit to the full text to see how much we aligned, right? And I think the act of doing that may have solved some of this problem inherently. So not necessarily needing to go to the full text as much as collaborating and communicating when we can, right? That's not always in our control. But it helped align our thinking and our approach to analysis. And it points to our shared thinking, right? It points to the fact that when we did look at the full text, we really were in agreement about in a lot of ways, what a useful source was in a broad sense. And the fact that we don't have time for full text points to the importance of this kind of collaboration, having these kind of conversations with faculty in our departments, but also maybe a problem with citation as representation, but that's another discussion. It also points to the opportunity to develop an exercise where the bibliography is revisited. There would be so much information literacy instruction inherent in the nature of that kind of exercise. That gets us to defining academic. The assignment specifies that, so coding our notes and discussions revealed that the instructor and librarian had somewhat different working definitions of the term or the concept academic. The assignment, this is what the assignment said about academic. Somebody asked about it earlier. It specified that sources should come from academic journals, right? That's it. That's the only time it uses the word academic. And from the library was another one, but we'll talk about that just now. So the instructor actually was using, it turned out, from the library and academic interchangeably in designing and grading the assignment. She thought of them as absolutely interchangeable, which shows that she sees them as inherently linked. And it also explains the frequency with which she applied the indicator from the library. Like she did it to almost 70% of the total bibliographies, because that's what the assignment said. And in a slightly different way, the librarian was actually, she used academic and peer-reviewed interchangeably. And again, we talked about this a little bit earlier in response to the question. And the reason that, and this is me, I will just say what I did, because the reason that I did that is that my experience working with teaching faculty and working with students is that often instructors do mean peer-reviewed when they say scholarly or academic. That had been my experience I've been a librarian for a long time, or for longish, I guess, for 15 years. But I'm also often, I think like other librarians, I'm in a position where I don't necessarily get to see the assignment. And so I've developed practices around that situation, right? If I don't get to see the assignment, I want to make sure that I am being maybe a little bit extra strict with the idea that I'm protecting the student. I don't want to hurt the student. I don't want to point the student to something that's not peer reviewed if that's actually what their instructor wants. So I've made a practice of recommending peer reviewed whenever a student asks for something that's academic or scholarly. And that was the wrong assumption for this assignment, because as I mentioned earlier, the instructor was actually open to gray literature, which is not necessarily peer reviewed. She was open to non-academic, peer-reviewed articles that were written by experts but might be a report on ongoing research or just a discussion of their research generally. So, you know, the implications of this are that, you know, the word academic is a pretty loaded one for librarians and instructors. It's pretty essential to our assessment of quality. So we kind of need to know what we mean by that term. So aligning the way that we aligning our work with students, instructors and librarians work with students, is really important. And for the transparency of the student, for the transparency of the rubric of the term to the student, I guess. So ultimately, it's all kind of about constructing authority, right? I mentioned this before, that, you know, the instructor looked at, did the students use the library? She was looking at the search process. I looked at their use of databases. I, the librarian, looked at the use of databases and did they use a variety of databases as an indicator that they were searching broadly and iteratively. So I was in some sense evaluating their search process. And if I'm going to do that, and if the instructor is going to focus on process, we need to make that explicit to students, that the search process is part of that we expect that to be part of constructing authority, and that searching broadly, you know, and digging down into that a little bit, that we think of searching broadly as allowing for thoroughness, that is part of how we're thinking about it, that the bibliography should reflect this breadth, that they will be graded accordingly, and that we want them to search this way. And alternatively, you know, if we don't feel like we want to grade them on these things, we need to know that we are evaluating in this way, and cut it out. Like, stop, don't grade them on that. Or if, you know, we may encounter students' research after they've already gotten the assignment, and so we can't change what's been made explicit to students in that case, and though making sure that we're grading them or guiding them based on what's actually been made explicit to them. So ultimately, I think of assessment as an act of constructing authority upon students' work, right? I'm bringing my own rubric to it, and I may or may not evaluate all of what students have presented me. I'm evaluating some of what they're presenting me, and I'm evaluating it with various weightedness, as is the instructor. So it's an act of constructing authority for both people. So keeping this in mind, it is really important that all working rubrics be explicitly stated to students. And so what do we do about that? Well, moving forward, I would say just make a practice of reflecting and unearthing, trying to unearth your working rubrics and stating it clearly, even if it's only to yourself, to figure out what you want to keep and apply and what you don't want to keep. And make a practice of aligning it in terms of align the measurements, the way that you're measuring students with the things that have been made explicit, and aligning your daily practices as much as you can with the instructors. I mean, I know collaboration is not always available, but there's some ways that we can sort of try to work around that. You know, we need to align our working rubrics and the way that we talk to students about sources and source evaluation and searching. And just in closing, I would say that, you know, just as our different subject knowledge and daily concerns might inform and distinguish our daily practices, reflection and collaboration can help inform and align them. And that's all I have. Does anybody have any questions for me at this point? I can stop sharing my screen, I think.
Yeah, we have about 9 minutes if folks wanted to ask a couple questions.
This is Dan McClure in Astoria.
Hi, Dan.
I think this is fascinating work. Thank you for
great, thank you.
sharing it. I appreciate it. I would love to see, and I know this is maybe an unrealistic idea, but I'm just going to float it out there anyway. It'd be great if to move beyond a meaningful but somewhat isolated experience with a small set of students and librarians and instructors, if the ACRL Oregon sponsors a study of, say, writing 121 and was able to get a representative sample of librarians and teachers to be involved in such a study, you might find some really interesting data from such a study.
Yeah, one of the recommendations that this is, by the way, this is based on a study that was published in June in collaborative librarianship, and the link to that is in the chat. But that's one of the recommendations for future studies is absolutely larger sample of bibliographies, right? Including samples of bibliographies that might be longer themselves, and certainly from multiple rather than just one librarian and one instructor. This was a case study, right? It's a pretty common situation where you have one librarian and one instructor, but it is only one librarian and one instructor. So looking across multiple librarians and multiple instructors, I think would be really fascinating, at least to me. Thanks, Dan. Dan says he'll read the article. I can't speak for ACRL Oregon on what they'll do, but I think that's a really interesting idea.
That's a fascinating idea. Maybe we'll pitch it.
Yeah, let us know.
Thank you, Dan.
Let us know, Anne.
Yeah.
Hi, this is Lori again from Mountain Hood Community College. Will you talk a little bit about, I found it a little fascinating that you didn't put much weight or ranking into the style formatting, consistency, and accuracy piece, but the instructor did.
Yeah.
And I just asked that as a community college librarian. We are so frequently asked to teach citation and to teach students how to do, whatever style it is, it doesn't really matter. APA, MLA, CSE, whatever. So I found that interesting that you, that wasn't any weight to you. Right. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure, absolutely. So that's I think that's such a great question because I've been at three libraries now. I've been at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. I've been at University of Illinois at Chicago, and I've been at Portland State University. And every single library has had a different policy with respect to teaching citation styles. And when I was at Michigan, to be honest, we didn't do it, but most of the students didn't really need it. They had different information needs. But at UIC, at University of Illinois Chicago, they did want to do it, and half of the library was split, and they said absolutely not. That is part of the teaching faculty's responsibility. We will point them to the guide, but we're not necessarily going to teach them. That's part of the writing, right? So there was a split there. And at Portland State, most of the instructors have taken it on themselves, so it hasn't been an issue. So I have not really done it. So it wasn't a concern to me personally, but I know that absolutely it would be a concern to other librarians. I think Dan's point super stands in light of this question, because that practice is like, I brought my own personal experience to that evaluation, right? And if I had been at Mount Hood and teaching citation, like how to format a citation and how to do it to students, I probably would have brought that lens to it, because my daily practice was definitely reflected in the indicators that I used. Does that sort of answer your question?
Yeah, that was great. Thank you. I appreciate it.
Yeah, that's a really good question.
We have time for one or two more comments or questions.
I have a question. This is Kelly at OSU. I'm curious if the instructor is going to change their rubric at all, or their approach to grading going forward.
Yeah, absolutely. She is. She and I've we've been working on this multi-year project for a long time, and she has given me such free reign with her assignments as a result. This was like a smaller piece, but we definitely, one of the things that this has led to is like a collaboration between us, but also she changed, she changed a bunch of things. Some of it was stating things outright. Some of it was being extra careful about how she was grading. Some of it was maybe explicating certain terms that we assumed a meaning for and realized that, and making it a more clear definition, and what like specific, for example, right? Explaining what you mean by being specific and how, or like searching, like we expect you to just search broadly. We expect to see multiple journals or multiple databases. She didn't do databases, but for example, in her in the bibliographies, that's as a reflection of the process, and making it clear she's started making it clear to students in how she talks to them and in the assignments that she is also looking at their search process, right? That became part of the assignment and part of a change in her practice. Another smaller thing that's related to the other study is that instead of giving a PDF or a link for required readings, she gives a citation as a way of scaffolding some of the stuff earlier, so she has an opportunity to have conversations about breadth of searching and topic specificity, and she's started requiring a preliminary bibliography assignment as a way of, right, being able to have that conversation earlier about all of those different indicators as a way of like repeating that information. So it's not just a document that spells out this is our rubric, but really like enacting the rubric in her work with students. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, absolutely. It did make me have a follow-up though, if we have a
Sure,
moment.
yeah.
So I'm curious if this has shifted how you talk to other instructors then, as far as
the collaboration piece. Yeah. It did, because if nothing else, and I try not to get too myopic about it, I get, because I think this is really important, right? And instructors they're not always on the same page with me yet. I have been able to at least point to some of the findings and say, hey, I've been working with Sarah Sterling in anthropology, and I've also worked with Alita Cantor in geography. And we have found this, right? And so when I can point to some of their colleagues that are faculty, it tends to carry a little weight. When I can say, hey, I'd like to try this. This is what we found, because obviously that's not our purview. We don't get to control the class, and we are not entitled to control the class. That's up to the teaching faculty. But if I can point to the study and point to some faculty members that they might know, or that they at least know are faculty, other teaching faculty, it tends to carry a little weight. I get a little more of what I want, or what I think should, but my expertise tells me it would be a good practice.
Well, we're at time right now, and we have one more question in the chat, but
Sure.
I just want to be cognizant of everyone's time. We at ACRL Oregon will be sending out an email with the evaluation form and the link to this presentation on our YouTube site. So expect an email from us in a couple of days. Beth, thank you so much for presenting in this topic, and a round of applause to you, even if you can't all hear everyone. And thank you everyone for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks for your interest.
Have a nice day.